but that's fine. So good everyone, welcome to week 2 of Stargazing. Great to see you all here. I hope you've had a good week. Everybody's safe and well. I hope you're all looking forward to some early releases here, like we've not been doing it this weekend, because I know we're all good and we follow the rules. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Daz. I'm one of the admins from Stargazers Lounge. I'm joined by Grant. Grant has got the Horsehead Nebula as his background, and cunningly given away with the name Grant on his picture. He's here doing all the background stuff, making sure the technical bits work, as he does with the forum. We are recording the session again this evening, so there'll be a little red icon somewhere on the screen to indicate that. And again, that'll be posted up and available. I think it's on the YouTube channel, isn't it, Grant? When we get that up there,
we'll post it up probably midweek.
Cool. So you can always replay it back, or for those that didn't manage to make it. And again, as we did last week, we'll keep you on mute just so that there's no noisy distractions, and it will just stop Zoom from flicking around from different people. People are still coming into the waiting room, so we'll. I think Grant's going to be letting those in as I waffle on. Again, many thanks to everybody who came along last week. We can tell from the feedback that you enjoyed the talk with Steve Richards, and thanks very much for all the contributions. There's a lot for us to look through and think about, and obviously we are going to be doing that in due course. So bear with us while we just work through those. Okay, so let's move on then. Again, there's no time limit tonight, so obviously Nick is aiming to talk for about an hour, but there'll be questions afterwards. But essentially, we're not tied down to any limit, so we could be here till the early hours of the morning. That's not going to be a problem. And again, as we did last time, Grant and I will monitor the chat facility, and we'll keep all the questions to the end, and then we'll work our way through those. It was nearly as long on the Q&A session as it was on the actual talk last week, so that was really interesting. Okay, so let's go on then. So let me introduce our speaker for this evening, a name I'm sure you'll recognise. Why is that out of kilter with that? Never mind. So tonight's speaker is Nik Szymanek, and I hope I've got that right, Nick. I've had some coaching from Grant via E. So Nick is very well respected and well renowned in the world of astrophotography and CCD imaging and processing. Author of at least 2 books, Infinity Rising and Shooting Stars. Certainly renowned for his deep sky imaging. If you get the chance, go and look at his Flickr stream. All the images on there are absolutely amazing. And I stole one earlier for the purposes of the slide deck. He was awarded the Amateur Achievement for Astronomical Society of the Pacific back in 2004. He still writes for Astronomy Now. He still reviews plenty of the images and the monthly photo on Astronomy Now. He works with the Telescope Live. He has got some telescope time, and again produces some absolutely stunning images from the data that they produce. So we're really grateful for Nick giving up his Sunday evening for us, and we are looking forward to this immensely. So no further ado, Nik Szymanek.
Thanks, Daz. Right, is that all okay?
Perfect.
Yep, okay. Well, it's a bit of an open-ended talk tonight. I'll try to cram in as much as I possibly can. The plan at the moment is to run through using Deep Sky Stacker, in that case to stack some Milky Way images, show what can be done with wide field DSLR images. I'll show you how you can process those once they've actually been stacked in Deep Sky Stacker as well. And then we'll move on and look at image calibration. Now, I know Steve talked quite a lot about image calibration last week, but what I'll do this week, I'll take it a step further from what Steve showed and show you in real time what happens when you calibrate images. And at the same time, we'll talk about what happens when you actually dither your images, and I'll explain about that when we get into it. And then we'll have a look at using programs like Photoshop and Fit's Liberator for pre-scaling images and then compositing into RGB and LRGB images in Photoshop. I'll also talk about narrowband imaging at the end of that, the differences between that and LRGB or RGB imaging. And then if there's time at the end, I'll say a little bit about the pros and cons of remote imaging, robotic imaging, with plenty of pretty pictures, because I suspect your brows may be a bit fevered by that point. So it'd be nice just to finish off with some images that we can just look at and enjoy, hopefully. Right, let's see if this will go. Okay, so I talked about Milky Way imaging, and this is an image shot from obviously under a very dark sky location. And this is a single 16-second shot of the Milky Way on a static tripod. Now, a lot of you have probably heard of something called the 500 rule, and that's a little calculation you can do that tells you the maximum amount of time you'll have with a particular lens before your images start to trail. And for my setup, in this case with a 28mm lens, it was about 18 seconds. This is a 16-second exposure. You can see it's done a reasonably good job. But of course, to get far better results, as with all forms of astronomical imaging, we need to stack images. And to do that, you really do need to have some kind of tracking mechanism. I've got a couple here. This was the very first one that I got actually as a review equipment some years ago. We took it out to Tenerife and put it through its paces, and it actually performed very well. It's the Astro Track, one of the very first ones that became available. I'm sure a lot of you are used to that. And I've also reviewed this one some years later, the Fornax Light Track mount, but these are just a couple. There's plenty of excellent ones from Skywatcher and many other companies, and they're all pretty reasonably priced. They're great for doing this kind of stuff, just short exposures where you want to keep the foreground nice and sharp and not trail the stars either, so they're great for that. But the very best results come from when you do what I said earlier on. You take multiple exposures, in this case 5-minute exposures on the Astro Track, and you stack them together to improve the signal to noise ratio. The idea being, in everyday terms, when you stack images, the signal component, i.e. the object you're photographing, the galaxy, the nebula, the Milky Way, whatever it is you're photographing, the signal component adds in a very linear sense, whereas the noise component adds at a much slower rate. So there are very good reasons to take plenty of images and stack them together. And that's the sort of result you can get just with a 28mm lens. You can also, if you're feeling a little bit kind of fired up, if you're working under a very dark sky site, you can take these panorama shots where you take multiple panes, and these are actually just made up of single 5-minute exposures, not stacked at all, but just by moving the camera's pointing just across the sky and taking these multiple exposures. And then when you get onto the computer, you can stack these all together, and don't try to do it yourself. You will end in abject failure, as I have as well. The best thing to do is just use panorama software like Microsoft Ice. If you've got a digital camera, the chances are you've got panorama software on your software disk that came with it. There's PTG UI, that's a really good free one, I think. I use Auto Pano Pro. But to do the job properly, it's better, once again, to take these multiple panes, and this time 5 or 6 here, 5 or 6 here, and so on across. And then when you add them all up, you get this nice, strong panorama of the Milky Way. So what we'll do first of all then, we'll go straight into Deep Sky Stacker. Now, for anybody who's not familiar with it, it's free software. It's always been free, and it's actually very, very good software for stacking images. That's what it's called, Deep Sky Stacker. And I've tested it with CCD images as well as DSLR images against programs like MaximDeal, which we'll look at in a minute, PixInsight, all the sort of high-end programs. And I really think Deep Sky Stacker can hold its own against these programs. Some people may disagree, but for a piece of free software, it really is punching above its weight. So with no further ado, I'm hopefully just be able to go straight into Deep Sky Stacker. Okay, so far so good. Now this is what the screen looks like when you open it up. There's a lot of stuff up here, but you don't really need to worry too much about most of that. So the first thing we'll do, we'll open up, in this case, just 4 images, because I don't want to spend too much time actually stacking, because it's quite a slow process. So I've shrunk these down in size a little bit, so they're not at the full resolution, but you'll see what happens. Now they've appeared down here, and what we can do is just come up to where it says check all, and what that does, it puts a little tick mark in the box here, which is saying to Deep Sky Stacker, yes, I want you to stack all of these images. I know they're all okay, so it's absolutely fine to do that. You can click on or right click on one of them and choose it to be the reference image to which all of the others are stacked. But for tonight's purposes, we don't need to do that. So the next thing to do is come down to where it says register checked pictures, and it opens up register settings. Now, most of the stuff I'll show you in this and the next menu are actually pretty much the default settings, I think. So you can come down to recommended settings, and it tells you a little bit of information here. You can spend a bit of time going through all these and you know, see what works for you. And then you can go into stacking parameters, because what the program will do, it will register the 4 images together, and then it will stack them. Now, there's lots of different options for stacking, as there is, or as there are in CCD imaging. So if you come through, I've left it on standard mode, which is the default setting. I've switched to median. I think average might be the default setting, but I've left it on median because that works well for me. And the rest of it, I haven't really bothered with, to be honest. I've gone through it and had a look, but didn't feel the need to change anything. So then click on OK. Once that's all right, you click OK one more time, and it's actually going through the process of registering and stacking the images. Now, it's pretty processor intensive. But I'll leave it to run because it shouldn't be much longer than about another 10 or 15 seconds, something like that. Oh, it's getting there even quicker. So I'll just let that go through it. Now, the next thing that happens really throws a lot of people off. If you're new to using the program, you've got all your lovely images, whether they're Milky Way or Galaxy or anything. And then when it appears on the screen like this, people say, oh, what's gone wrong? It shouldn't look like that at all. The advice I would give you is that's all you need to do in Deep Sky Stacker. From this very point on, just go down here, save picture to file, and then just call it, let's just call it Milky Way DSS. All these are the native settings, I think, and then just save, and that's it. We're finished with Deep Sky Stacker now. So the next thing to do, we'll now go over to Photoshop. The point I'm making here is that I recommend that you don't use Deep Sky Stacker for image processing. Just use it for stacking. And then you can use any other program that recognizes TIFF files. So that will be Photoshop, GIMP, the free software, Affinity Photo, which is an up and coming star, which is a really good piece of software. So here it is. And when I open it in Photoshop, you can see it doesn't look anything like it did in Deep Sky Stacker. So that horrible white bleached grey screen is something that puts people off and confuses people. So while we're here then, let's have a look at this image. Now, you might see it on the screen and think, well, yeah, you know, I'm quite happy with that, but there's a lot we can do to this image to make it look a lot better than it is at the moment. And the very first thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to crop the edges off, because if I zoom in, you'll see there's lots of hideous distortions around the edge. I'm using a very, very cheap lens to do this photography, I'm ashamed to say. So the first thing, because the Milky Way is just on this part of the image, we don't need all that outer stuff. So we might as well just crop it off, bring the file size down a little bit as well. So that's helped a little bit with the outlying stuff. Now, it's always worth a look at the levels menu. Steve touched on this last week. One of the questions was, should I make the sky background jet black? You know, everybody knows space is black, right? Well, wrong, it isn't. And I think Steve said that as well. The thing is, when you're processing astro images, deep sky images particularly, there's always an interface between the target and the sky background. And if you go onto the curves menu or the levels menu or whatever menu you use, and really darken the sky background, what you'll find is that interface, that sort of transition zone between the object and the sky background becomes kind of truncated. It becomes very unnatural, and it's a bad thing. So what I suggest you do initially, and I'll show you this in a second, is to leave the sky background a little bit brighter than you normally would. So we can check the sky background using Photoshop's levels menu. And it's most of the processing stuff is available under adjustments, levels, for example. And I'll actually, to save time, I've set up keyboard shortcuts. So I'll tell you what menu I'm going to use, and I'll just use a shortcut to go in there. Now you can see the histogram here starting to rise. So the black pixels are on the left, the so-called black point is over here, the white pixels are on the right. And as we may have suspected, there is a bit of a disagreement here. The image background is a little bit light. So what we can do is just bring the black point slider over. You can see the midpoint slider is moving as well. And something like that's okay, but as I just pointed out, I'm going to leave a little bit of headroom here because that can always be adjusted later on. The trouble is if you make the image too dark to start off with, then there's sometimes, you just have to go back and start again. So I'm going to click OK. Now, that's looking better. I hope you'll agree. Now, the next thing is you can see the sky background's a little bit sort of greenish. Now, there's many, many ways you can deal with this, but I'm just going to show you one that does seem to work fairly well. And it's actually a plugin for Photoshop. It's called Gradient Exterminator. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about that already, or maybe are using it. Now, it's been around a long time. It's an actual plugin for Photoshop rather than a separate program. And the way you would normally use it would be to draw a selection around your target and then invert the selection so that what you're working on is the outside area of the selection. And then you call up Gradient Exterminator. It's a very simple menu, and that's its default setting. But I'm not going to draw that selection around the Milky Way. I'm just going to run Gradient Exterminator on the whole image. But it normally does quite a good job. Now, hopefully you can see the difference here. What I'll do, I've got my second monitor, which you can't see. I'm just going to go back one step and show you the before and after. And you can see, hopefully, it's done a pretty good job of evening up that sort of gradient that appeared on the image. You may notice on the before, the bit lower in the sky is quite a bit brighter than the darker bit up here. But if we just apply a simple run of Gradient Exterminator, you can see it's done a great job. I'm happy with that. Now, at this point, I'll introduce you to one of Photoshop's most powerful tools for CCD color work, and it's the selective color menu. Once again, it's under Image, Adjustments, Selective Color. And this is what it looks like. You've got 4 sliders here with cyan, magenta, yellow and black on the left, and you've got a drop menu up here with all these colors in, and it always defaults to the red one first. Now, one thing I will say about the selective color menu, this isn't a scientific approach to image processing. I think it's fair to say that most of us don't adhere to a scientific approach, if there is such a thing. I don't know. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go through this little menu, show you how it works, and you'll see that I'm just doing this by eye effectively. But what I'll do first, just to make life a bit, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, and then I'll call that up again. And what we'll do, the way I always work with this, this menu, is to start off with the red. You come down to these sliders, and you literally just adjust them on the screen to see what effect they have on your image. So what I'm doing here, I'm moving the cyan slider to the left because what I'm hoping to do is bring up some of the faint colors that I'm hoping are sort of lurking in this central dusty part of the Milky Way. That's fine, I'm okay with that. Magenta, the same sort of thing here. Well, you can see the effect it's having, whether it's improving, it may be a tad. Yellow, it's exactly the same thing with all these sliders. Yeah, I'm liking the look of that. Once that's done, come down to the next one, yellows. Do exactly the same thing. Yeah, it's looking quite good. Yeah, these are all quite good modifications, not having to do too much. So the next one, green. Again, this might help to remove a little hint of that remaining sky background. Not making a lot of difference, so that's fine. We don't need to do too much with that. Come down to cyan, you get the idea. Just doing the same sort of thing. It's not making too much difference. That's fine though. We've got it looking pretty much where we want. We can just come down to blue. Yeah, you can see how it's affecting the stars a little bit. We're not really doing them too much of a favour, so we won't bother with that. And maybe just magenta. Yeah, okay, it's making. Yes, you might see if you look at the bright stars in the image, it's helping to reduce some of the halos around the stars. But I'm not going to sort of faff around with that too much. Just going to click on OK. So far, so good. Now, what about? Let's see, what else can we look at? Okay, I'll give you another tip, which you may or may not agree with, you may or may not like. But if you find when you're processing images like this, particularly working with images that are affected by light pollution, if you find that you're not really getting the results that you really want, there's a really good tool. And I normally steer clear of anything in Photoshop that says auto. But if we come up to image, and then just come down to auto color. I don't know what this is going to do. Well, okay, it's pretty dramatic. I'm not sure if you prefer that to my version. It's much more contrasty. The sky background's quite a bit darker. But what you can do, if you apply the auto color and you think, well, it's much too much, it's too contrasty or whatever, but I'd like to keep elements of that. If you've applied the auto color without doing anything else, if you come up to where it says edit and then fade auto color, you get this fade menu. And there's one slider. 100% is the image you're seeing now. 0% is the image before we applied the auto color. So you could say to yourself, well, let's just try a little bit of that just to darken that sky background a tad. And maybe something like that, 44%. Let's see how we think about that. Well, okay. I think that's looking all right on my screen. There's another little thing we can do, which I can tell you about, which you may or may not know about, and that's how we can deal with these chromatic aberration halos around the bright stars. Again, due to the fact that I'm using a very, very cheap lens. Now, Photoshop has got a very good tool in it called the Camera Raw menu, which I'm always spouting on about in my Astronomy Now articles. It's under Filter, and it's under Camera Raw Filter. And what it does, it opens up a little sub menu within Photoshop with some incredibly useful tools over here on the right hand side. And I don't want to spend too long on this, but what I can show you, for example, is one of the tools in here for dealing with this chromatic aberration. It's really easy to use. You've got all these different buttons along here, and I won't dwell on those, but if you go to this one here, which says lens correction, you've got a defringe slider here, and all you need to do is drag the purple amount a little bit to the right, not much, say a value of about 2, and hopefully you can see on the screen that that chromatic aberration has been obliterated. We'll click on OK. And if I show you off screen the before and after, it's done a pretty good job of dealing with that, but it hasn't done too much harm to the Milky Way itself. So that's looking pretty good. Now, what I'll do just before we leave this image is I'll go back and show you the image that we actually started with, and then hopefully you'll see the benefit of what I've just been talking about. So that's where we started off, and at the time perhaps it didn't look quite as bad as that, but after all the things that we've done, we've adjusted the levels, gradient exterminator, selective color, auto color, fade auto color, and the Camera Raw filter. And hopefully you'll agree that that's a much nicer image. And of course, if you want to do the job properly, you won't just use four images, you'll use a lot more than that. So that's it for the Milky Way stuff. I'll save this just in case anyone's got any questions on it later on. I'll just call it anything just for quickness, and then we can close that down. So next thing we can look at will be, let's have a look. Image calibration. Right, okay, this is really important, so I'll go straight into this. And for this demonstration, I'll show you using Deep Sky Stacker, using Maxim DL. Now, what I've got on the screen here are 4 hydrogen alpha images of part of the Rosette Nebula. Now, these are 15-minute exposures taken with a hydrogen alpha filter. And if I zoom in on this, you'll see all sorts of horrible things. Can you see all these pixels on the screen? There's like cosmic ray impacts. If I go to, let me just shrink this down a bit. If I go to the top corner there, you'll see some image cutoff, and I'll show you why that happens in just a minute. The first thing I'd like to show you though is how we can assess what's going on in these images. The first thing I need to do, just for this procedure to work, is just equalize the screen stretch. So hopefully these 4 images are looking the same. And now I'm going to switch into one of Maxim's really useful tools called the Animate menu. This is what it looks like. And our 4 images are open on the left. I'm just going to say add all and click OK. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And what I'm going to show you here is a 4-frame movie, i.e. those 4 images which we put together. Now, what I'd like you to notice on this display is that the hot pixels are remaining fixed on the screen, and the 4 images in the back, it looks like they're in the background. They're just kind of dancing around a little bit, sort of randomly. Now, this is because when I was taking these 4 images, I've applied an effect called dithering. And this is a really important tool when you're working with CCD imaging. In everyday terms, you just instruct your mounts when you're setting up your imaging sequence to shunt the mount by a couple of pixels in a kind of semi-random direction. And when you now take all of your images and show them like this, the noise, which is common to all of the image, not the cosmic ray impacts. In fact, if you look here, you can see these cosmic ray impacts just coming and going on the image. But the noise is staying fixed, and because of dithering, the stars and the nebula are dancing around. So far so good. I'm going to stop that. I'm going to close this down again, and I'm going to reopen the same menu, but I'm going to do something slightly different this time. I'm going to add the 4 images, but this time I'm going to align them. Okay, just click on OK. It shouldn't take too long to do that. And then just click OK. Now, the difference between what you just saw, I'll leave you to, dear viewers, I'll leave you to see what difference you can see. Now, you're either all shaking your fists at the screen or shouting and hollering, but because I can't hear you, I'll tell you what's happening. Now, the stars and the nebula are perfectly aligned. It's a sub-pixel alignment. And now the noise is being spread around. But rather than just moving around sort of en masse, because it was all on the same part of the chip, what we're finding now is that the noise has been spread out. So this is the process of dithering, which is really important. I won't say too much about that now. I'll stop this. I'm going to come out of the menu. I'm just going to close these down. I mustn't save the changes. And then I'm going to open them again with 2 other files, which I'd like you to have a look at. Okay, this is one, and this is a dark frame. And you can see all these pixels on here. You know, you might recognize them because you saw them kind of in that earlier image. That earlier image, by the way, hadn't been calibrated. And then I'd like you to look at this one as well, which is a flat field. Now, Steve talked about this last week and showed some images. I'll show you how we can apply these to those 4 images, and you'll see a huge difference that it makes. So what you're seeing on the flat field is vignetting in the 4 corners due to the fact that I'm using a focal reducer that isn't evenly illuminating the imaging plane. These are dust donuts. These are probably probably on the glass sheet over the sensor perhaps, and these bigger ones are out of focus. They're probably on one of the filters. So I can close these down, don't need those anymore. And what I'm going to do is apply those 2 images to these 4 of the Rosette Nebula. And in Maxim, just go to Process, Calibrate All, Job Done. Now I'd like you to look again more closely at this image. Let's just move that over a little bit. And I'm hoping, which one is this, Rosette 4? I'm hoping you can see that pretty much all of those hot pixels have been eradicated. If I show you the before and after, you can definitely see them on there pre-calibration, and now they're gone. But what I'd also like you to look at is on the top corner of this image, where we had that vignetting, and down here, let me just zoom out a little bit. If you remember, if I undo that, you can see the cutoff in the corners by the vignetting. And if I redo it, it's all that data has been recovered. So bear in mind that that flat field that I showed you, all of that gunk that was on there, the vignetting, the pixel, the dust donuts, every time you take an image of the sky, that stuff is in there. When it comes to really stretching the process, you're going to struggle because all that stuff's in there. If you do the flat fielding and the dark frames properly, and Steve talked about that last week, so I won't talk too much about it tonight. But if you do the job properly, you can see it does away with all of those horrible things. So now we can go ahead and stack these, and I'll just do this briefly in Maxim because it doesn't take too long, and then I'll show you again the benefit of stacking 4 15-minute exposures. Call up Maxim's stacking menu. We can just say add images. These are the 4 that are on the screen. Click on OK, and they're up here. Now you'll notice that Maxim's got a question mark next to them. It's saying, all right, you've loaded these, but I don't really know anything about these files. Would you like me to measure the quality of them? So we would, and we say measure all, and this won't take long. And happily, thankfully, it's put 4 ticks next to these. It's saying, yep, everything's okay with these, and we can monitor the quality of these. If we click on them one at a time, over on the right here, we've got two values. There's 4, but I've unticked 2. The 2 we're particularly interested in is the roundness, which is the quality of the guiding that you've got. And the other one is the full width at half maximum. You can think of that as a kind of measure of the signal component of the image related to maybe the seeing conditions and maybe related to the guiding and, you know, all the sort of things that can sort of degrade an image. I won't spend too much time on that. But these are both really important things. So what Maxim's telling us, this number 3 image actually is the best roundness, 1 out of 4. 1 is the best out of the 4, and full width half max is 2 out of 4. So that's good as well. It's the second best. So we can just click on this and say, make that the reference image. The next tab is Align. Maxim has lots of different ones. The best one that works 99% of the time is auto star matching. We ignore color, we're just working with monochrome image, and then combine. Again, lots of different things here. I find one of the best ones is SD mask. This is like a Sigma type stacking algorithm. What it'll do, it'll look at our reference image, and if any of the other images have got any noise that isn't in our reference image, it'll just remove that noise and fill it in with an average of the pixel values around it. So this is good. So I won't hang around. We'll click go. Again, it shouldn't take too long. And that's it, we're done. So now what we've got here is our stacked image. And if I zoom in on that, we can compare. Just bring this over a bit so I can reach the sliders. What we've got now here is four 15-minute images. So in general terms, not precise terms, but in general terms, we're looking at an image that's equal to a single 1-hour exposure. But if I show you just a single image, and I'll just zoom in roughly to the same area. Yeah, again, just move that over. You can see it's quite noisy. It's clean in that it's been calibrated, but the background's a little bit noisy. If we compare it to our image here, much, much smoother. So This is just four images, an hour's worth. If there's time at the end of the talk, when I talk about robotic imaging, I'll show you some of the images that Ian King and myself have taken over the years that are equivalent to, say, like 80 hours worth of exposures. But I'll say more about that when we get to it. So that's image calibration and stacking. So we can come out of this now, close all these down. Nope. And just get rid of Maxim for now. So the next thing, CCD imaging. Well, okay, just a couple of images here. People like to see what equipment people are using. This is my back garden observatory around about this time last year, I think. It's upgraded ever so slightly since then. This is the camera that I've been using for about, must be 8 or 9 years now, I think, which is a QSI camera. I think Steve uses a similar version to this, and he talked about the advantages in that the filter wheels inside, the off-axis guider is integral. There's a prism inside connected via a port. So both the guider and the imaging sensor are sampling the same stars effectively. So it tends to do away with the problem of flexure. One question I get asked a lot is, do you ever have trouble finding a guide star? Simple answer, no, never, not once, ever. And that's because the Lodestar guide camera, which I've bin 2x2, is in front of any filters in here, particularly narrowband filters. So an exposure time of 5 seconds is guaranteed to find a guide star every single time, and it has. So I always recommend, if you're doing deep sky work with a longer focal length telescope, consider getting yourself an off-axis guider. And this is a more recent image. And what we're looking at here is a 10-inch Ritchie Crescent telescope, GSO. Very, very nice scope, actually, very good optics. The carbon fiber tube, so great thermal stability, mounted on a rather venerable Paramount ME, which is just does what it says on the tin every night. Just go out, job done. And then on the top, to replace the Pentax refractor I was using on the old scope, I just recently invested in this William Optics 73mm scope, and on the back, actually this picture shows it's set up for imaging. With that is the QSI camera. On the back of this telescope, incidentally, is a Moonlight electronic focuser, because again, it's far better to either have a hands-free focuser so that you can focus yourself, or even better, use the software to robotically focus that for you. So it takes a little bit of setting up, but it does pay off. Okay, so now we'll move on to creating RGB and LRGB images in FITS Liberator and Photoshop. And the reason I've called up FITS Liberator is that if people are working with Photoshop or GIMP or Affinity, it doesn't recognize FITS images. So we had to use FITS Liberator first, just to make sure that we convert the FITS files to TIFF files, which can be opened. So what I'm going to do here, I won't go through the whole procedure here because I've got my eye on the time, but I'll show you basically what happens. You open your image in FITS Liberator. It's an image of the Trifid Nebula. The image appears in the window here, and let me just reset this because I've got a bit of ahead of myself here. This is how it'll open. You've got your histogram down here, and lots of information over here. You don't need to worry too much about this, but what I'm going to draw your attention to is the thing I just clicked on hastily, the stretch function. Now, you can zoom in on these images and you can have a little play with this, and you may find you get good results, but I find when I'm working with deep sky images, I prefer to use a slightly different stretch function, this ArcSine H1, and it just rescales the image. You can see the histogram's changed, and to my eyes, it's done a much better job. It's a kind of logarithmic scaling, which brightens the object of interest, doesn't overcook the stars too much or the sky background, just does a pretty good job. And the idea is that once you're actually happy with your deep sky image, remember this is, at this stage, this is still a FITS image. We've applied a stretch, and you might want to have a play with some of these others in here, but I find this ArcSine H1 works particularly well. Once you're happy with that image, you literally just click Save File, and you'd call it, in this case, M20 Red. Well, I've done that already, so I won't run through the same procedure with the blue and the green and the luminance, I'll just cancel, but that's the sort of thing you would do. So Fits Liberator, very, very easy to use. One thing I would say, just keep an eye on down here where it says channels. Make sure 16-bit is always selected. I don't know, some years ago now, I found that I'd be working through this, scaling the images, and this 16-bit thing would jump onto 8-bit. And really, that's not such a good thing. It should be on 16-bit all the time. So just keep an eye on that, but it should be fine. And then once you've done that to all your images, remembering, of course, that your images have been calibrated and stacked and did and all this kind of stuff I just went on about. So now we'll go back into Photoshop and I'll open up these the images that we've just kind of pretended to so we've got M20 blue, green and red. Here they are on the screen. Now you may notice as I put these together, the red image is nice and sharp, the stars lovely, quite bright, these stars, and probably overexposed or saturated, but nice and pinpoint. But as the imaging run went on, you can see these stars beginning to get halos across them, and this one even worse. This was because during this imaging run, I was actually watching this in real time. This was taken from Chile. There must have been high haze or something coming over, so I was thinking, oh, curses, because the first data that you see on the screen was actually really good. But that's another story. So what we'll do for now, we'll just call up the levels menu, and happily, you can see what I talked about earlier on. We've got this little gap between where the black point is and the pixels start to rise up. That's absolutely fine. We don't need to do any scaling to that at all. And I'll assume that it's not too bad with the other two files as well. So with no further ado, what I'll do is we'll call up Photoshop's channels menu, because we're going to use this to combine the three images. So to do that, you have the channels menu on screen. If you can't find it, it's normally under, definitely under Windows Channels. Just click on that and it'll bring it up on the screen. And then you come to this rather obscure little box up here and scroll down to Merge Channels. It brings up this tiny little menu, and we want to change the mode to RGB color. Channels 3, yeah, that's fine. Click on OK. And then one last little menu. And what we've got here are the red channel, the green and the blue. And we need to ensure that we get our 3 TIFF files in the appropriate channel. You can see they become a little bit scrambled here. That's not a problem. We click on the arrow, go to red to make sure it's in the red channel. Green's already in there, that's fine. Click on blue. And then one final click on OK. There's our color image. So not too difficult, providing your data's reasonably good. And you can scale those images in Fits Liberator, but also in Photoshop prior to doing this, to remove any gradients and any aircraft trails and all this kind of stuff that messes up our images. One thing you may contend with, and I've left it like this purposely, you can see that the images aren't actually in proper alignment, but you can also deal with that in the channels menu as well. Let's say we're going to move the blue channel over towards the green channel. So you've got the blue channel here, the red channel just offset to the lower right, and the green sort of in the middle. So we tell Photoshop to select the red channel, and that changes to a monochrome view, but we want to see this in color. So what you have to do is just click on RGB, and it changes it back to the color view, but only the red channel is selected. And then you can come across here to Photoshop's Move tool, and you can move the red channel independently of the other two. If you want to do it a bit more sort of fine-tuned, you can use the keyboard cursor keys. That's okay. We'll do, leaving that selected, we'll just go to blue. We'll do the same thing with the blue channel. That's done. Remember to just click back to RGB, and then you've got a nicely aligned image. And from this point onwards, you could, for example, do all sorts of stuff on this. You could adjust the color balance. You could use the, what's the name that we used earlier on? Selective color. So once again, You can see it's sort of what sort of effect it's having on it, and I'll leave that up to you. There's no scientific way of doing this. I mean, fortunately, the image is looking reasonably good anyway. It doesn't need too much doing to it, but you can come down and just change all these settings, and you can see how it's affecting the image. I should point out also that these exposures are very short. This is only something like 3 lots of 10 minutes per filter. So once we're happy with that, what I can show you now is how we can create an LRGB image. This is where we overlay this color image on top of a luminance image, where we've used just a clear filter to maximize the amount of signal coming from it, from the object. So hopefully I've got one in here. Yep, that's it. So it's a much stronger image in terms of the signal. Let's just have a quick look at the levels. Yeah, that's absolutely perfect. Now, the thing you have to do first, one of the very important steps, is you have to convert this first of all into an RGB image. If you look up at the file name, it says grey 16-bit. Well, of course, it's a grey 16-bit image. It was shot with a hydrogen alpha filter. It's a black and white image. But if we want to make this, turn this into a color image where we can bring that color information in, we just come up to image mode and then just scroll down to RGB color. You won't see the image change in any way, shape or form. But now it means we can paste this other data in. So I'll do Control A to select it, and you can tell it's selected, hopefully because of the marching ants. Control C, Control D, and then back to the luminance image, and then Control V. Now, I think these are in alignment, so I don't need to make any further sort of adjustments between the two images. But there's one final step, and that is to use Photoshop's layers menu, which I'll bring over here. So what we have here is our background image, which is, this is the luminance file, and layer 1 is our RGB data. At the moment, they're not really talking to each other all that much. They're in an unhappy alliance. So what we need to do is find some way of blending these together. And it's dead easy. You just come up to the blend menu up here in the layers menu, go to, the one I use is color. And what you're looking at on the screen now is the LRGB version. So the great thing is about these is that you have these two images as separate files. They're communicating to each other, but you could still apply color processing to the luminance image. You can still apply, for example, sharpening or contrast enhancement, anything like that to the luminance layer. You might find it doesn't work particularly well. You may find it easiest just to blend it all down. But before you do blend it down, there's one more thing which may sound a little bit non-intuitive, but I recommend you blur the color layer. And the tool I use for that is Photoshop's Gaussian blur tool. Bring this down to about 2 to 3, something like that. It's applying quite a heavy blur. And then apply that, and you're actually applying it just to the color layer, of course. So make sure the color layer is selected. So you can see it's a little bit blurry there. But what this will do, if you have any noise in your images, like grain, anything like that, halos perhaps around the stars, you'll find that the Gaussian blur should actually help a lot of that. It's actually a nice way to work. And then I'll show you the properly processed version of this at the end. We should have time, so I'll run through the properly processed. I'm just doing this kind of on the fly at the moment. There's a lot of stuff that needs doing to this image, but that demonstrates LRGB. Now, I'm sure perhaps a lot of you may be slightly confused by the fact that I've laid the RGB data on top of the luminance data. You may do it another way, in that you'll have the color layer as the base, and you'll paste the luminance layer on top. And then, rather than using color, I believe you use luminosity, I think. Now, the end result is exactly the same. It's just two ways of doing the same thing. The reason I've always done it like this, because I was shown this method by the guy that actually invented it way back in, it was about must have been back in about 92, 93, a guy called Robert Dalby. He actually invented this LRGB technique, and he sort of explained it to us, and we realized the power of it. And then within 6 months, amateur astronomers worldwide were doing it. But somewhere along the line, it got kind of skewed to doing it that other way. But the end result is exactly the same. So it's entirely up to you how you do that. So, okay, that's RGB and LRGB. Let's get rid of all this stuff, because what I'd like to do now, I think, is narrowband imaging. Now, it's quite similar, but we just need to approach it in a slightly different way. So what I'll do here, I'm going to create something using the Hubble palette. It's called an SHO image, and I'll explain why it's called that in a second. Can I just have a reality check with Grant for a minute, if he's... Grant?
Yep.
Is everything working okay at the moment in terms of display and...
Yeah, it's been perfect so far for me, yeah.
Okay, I'll press on, thanks.
Thank you. So
the next thing we'll do here is open up 3 narrowband images. Oops, just come to that. And let me show you what we've got here. 1, 2, 3. This is 3 images of the Eta Carina Nebula, one of the most amazing objects in the sky, taken from a telescope in Australia with an ultra-wide field view, an extremely ultra-wide field view, because it's a huge object, but it's an incredibly sort of lovely thing. It's one of the sort of nicest nebulae in the sky. And this is the hydrogen alpha view. And you might be able to see, if I zoom in, some incredible detail. This object up here is actually a lovely target in its own right if you're using a longer focal length telescope. I'll show you some images of that a bit later on. Now, if you remember on the previous part of the talk, we created an RGB image. Well, we're going to do something similar, but this will be an SHO image. And it's called that because the S is for sulfur, the H is for hydrogen, and the O is for oxygen. So what we're going to do is exactly the same technique as just now, almost, in that we're going to use the channels menu to merge channels, multi-channel to RGB as we did before, click on OK. And this time, where we had our red, green and blue channels, we've still got those, but rather than pasting a red, green or blue image, what we're going to do here is paste our sulfur 2 image into the red channel, our hydrogen alpha image into the green channel, and our oxygen 3 image into the blue channel. So we've got SHO, hence the name. Click on OK, and that is what's known as a Hubble palette image. You may notice there's a little bit on the green side, and that's basically because the green channel has the hydrogen alpha data in, and this of course is by far the strongest data of the three sort of image sets. Now, we all love the Hubble palette, but we don't like it looking like this. I don't know how many of you remember that incredible evening on the news when they announced those pictures of the pillars of creation. And you know, Ian and I were sort of imaging in colour at that point. This was before we had narrowband filters, but we said, you know, I remember talking to Ian on the phone saying, did you say it was green? You know, it should be red, you know, what's going on? But of course they're mapping these images to different wavelengths. You know, obviously narrowband filters are incredibly different to RGB filters. So, and once these filters became available to the amateur community, you know, we embraced them because they have so many strengths in terms of their ability to block light pollution and to produce these really detailed views. But we start off with a Hubble palette image like this, and it's not all that attractive. So let me get rid of the channels menu, and our first port of call will be calling up the selective color menu again. Now, again, I think this night might have been a little bit hazy towards the end, or when the S2 data was taken. It may have been on a separate night. Got a few halos around. I'm not going to worry too much about them. What I'm going to concentrate on here is the colours in the nebula. And you know, it may not surprise you, having heard what I said about the RGB data, in that the narrowband data is it's kind of, it's a false color image more than anything. That's the term I was looking for, a false color image. And we can approach the process anyhow we like with this. So let's just have a little play and see what happens. Okay, well, maybe that'll help reduce the halos a little bit. Yeah, that makes it a little bit more green. Not interested in that. Okay, this may have helped a little bit. We'll press on yellows. Oh, okay. We can see something happening here. And at this point, I should say that when most people are processing images of the Hubble palette, we tend to like having the oxygen 3 sort of continuum in the image, showing us kind of a nice blue and the strongest parts of the nebula with a kind of golden sort of yellowy color, completely subjective, of course. So that's the kind of thing I'm aiming for at the moment with this rather random attempt to process the image in front of you. You can see some things are improving it, some aren't perhaps, so we'll press on green. Oh, okay, so we take that slider down a little bit just to try and get rid of that sort of green color a little bit. Yeah, okay, it's looking a bit better. Completely subjective, of course. Yeah, bring the cyan up a little bit. Yeah, that's it. Again, it's entirely up to you how you do this. Blues. Yeah, it's looking all right. Take that down a little bit. And then the magenta slider probably won't make too much difference. It may get rid of those. No, it's not making too much difference. There's something else we can do to deal with those halos. So I'm going to stop there. And this is our SHO image. So as I like to do, I'll show you the original image before we applied the selective color menu to it. And it was that, a bit green. And now we've got something which is more closely approximating the Hubble palette. What I'm going to do now, though, is something you may or may not agree with, you may or may not have heard about, or maybe it's something you do yourself. But I'm going to create the equivalent of an LRGB image. And this is where I'm going to use the hydrogen alpha component as the luminance file. Now remember, the hydrogen alpha component's already in here, but don't worry about that. So what we'll do, we'll open up that same hydrogen alpha component again. I'll just check the levels. I don't think it's, yeah, that's fine. I think we did that before. As before, exactly this in complete analogy to what we did with the RGB image or LRGB image. When we were setting it up, I'm going to convert the image to, whoops, convert this to an RGB. You won't see any change. We'll paste our SHO image on top, Control V. Oh, he says, got to select it first. Sorry, I've done this wrong way around. Bear with me a second. Control D, back to this, Control V. And so what we've now got, if I bring our layers menu back over, this is now our, we can call this SHO. And call this, I won't even bother renaming it. It's just our background. It's the hydrogen alpha layer. And exactly as I did before is select the upper layer. I'm just going to blend these two together using color. Okay, I can get rid of the layers menu for now. And this is what is the equivalent of an LRGB image. Looks a little bit bright. Perhaps we'll just, what's the quickest way to do this? Curves maybe. I've selected the background layer. Let's bring this down a little bit. Yeah, something like that. Oh, good. And it's worth in passing mentioning that when you're making tonal changes to your image, don't use the levels menu, use the curves menu, because that keeps the black and white points fixed compared to the levels menu, which is fine for checking your black and white points. But if you start making tonal adjustments with the levels menu, you'll find that the black and white points shift. As before, I'm going to select just off screen the SHO image, the narrowband image. I'm going to apply a Gaussian blur exactly the same as before. But what I'll do this time is I'll give it a slightly stronger Gaussian blur, because what I'm going to try and do is get rid of some of those halos around the stars. Now, what you have to bear in mind, you may not be sort of familiar with this idea of why I'm blurring it. I'm not affecting the spatial resolution of the image in any way, shape or form. All I'm doing is smoothing the color noise, which is then being blended with the luminance data, the hydrogen alpha data. And if I show you that, the before and the after, it's definitely done a good job of fixing those halos, and it's probably smoothed out the color data as well. So what I would normally suggest at this point, you can save it as a layered file, but just for brevity, I'll flatten the image. I'm just going to use Control F to flatten it into a single layer. And then we can just apply a little bit further processing, maybe to help address this background, which is a little bit sort of reddish. There's many ways we can deal with that, but a way that worked quite well on this image when I was just kind of faffing around with it was the hue and saturation menu, which is available up here with all the rest. Okay, and what I'm going to do here, you've got another one of these drop lists like we saw before. I'm going to select magentas, and then these three sliders will affect the magenta component of the image. So I'm just going to take the saturation down on the magenta. I'm hoping that might just help smooth out that sky background a little bit. Let's just have a look at the before and after. Well, it's not made that much of a difference, but again, that's a good method you can work with. You can work with things like color balance, which is just up here somewhere, are we? Select shadows, because we're interested in the sky background, and you can just drag the red slider down a little bit. Yeah, it's maybe just neutralize the red a tad. It's possible that has affected the levels menu. Yeah, it's just shifted the pixels over a little bit too far, but you get the idea. There's plenty of different ways of doing this sort of thing. Then, of course, you can still, once you've flattened the image down like this, you can still call up the good old selective color menu and just have a play and you know, try and enhance some of these details in the nebula. So I won't go through this again. You get the idea. There's plenty you can do, and I'll show you the proper version of this in just a second. So that's narrowband imaging with SHO images and creating sort of synthetic luminance frames out of your hydrogen alpha data. And the reason we did that, of course, is the hydrogen alpha data is so strong in comparison to the other sort of two wave bands. So I hope that makes sense. Now, the last part of the talk, am I okay for about 10 more minutes?
Yeah,
okay?
no problem.
Just switch back to PowerPoint. I've probably got a load of stuff here that I don't need. Let's just go forwards a bit. Yeah, I was going to talk about these, but we don't really need to see these much now. Just I'll go straight on to these are just images I've shot from home. Yeah, I think this one showed up earlier on in the intro. That's just done with that little Pentax refractor. This is an example of a narrowband SHO image using the hydrogen alpha frame as a luminance frame, and likewise with this one as well, the Sol Nebula. This is the North America Nebula. That's the Orion Nebula in pure narrowband. That's it with a combination of luminance and RGB. So there's all sorts of things you can do with these images to mix them up. Won't go through that. I'm just going to go right to the last part of the talk. I'll just scroll through these quickly. Almost there. Robotic imaging. Okay. Now, this is something I've been involved with for, Ian and I, we first got a robotic set up in Spain, must have been about 6 or 7 years ago now, I think. And it really sort of pays to do something like that. But you've got two options. You can, well, first of all, as you see on the screen here, the advantage is you've got access to prime imaging locations, access to southern hemisphere targets, and access to high-end imaging equipment. And on the left, you've got telescope system rental. So this is something like Telescope Live or one of the many others, or any of the others that offer this sort of rental system. The advantages are you don't have to buy any equipment at all. All you're doing is you're paying for the time used on the systems, and you've got a choice of imaging systems. So most remote imaging platforms have long focal length scopes for detailed work, galaxies, this kind of stuff. Wide field imaging scopes, you can sort of pick and choose. The disadvantages, as it says here, expensive hourly rate, telescope availability. You'll be competing with other people to use these telescopes. And some of them are pretty heavily subscribed, so you may have to wait a little bit of time for the data. If you go down the route that Ian and I did some years ago, ownership of a remote system, well, we bought an imaging rig and sent it out to Spain. And we're actually on our third imaging location now, and we're on the very best one now, which is IC Astronomy. And the options there, if you've got your own system, you've got access to it every night. You can go for these incredibly deep images, which I'll show you in a second. You've got your own choice of system, and you go with it. The disadvantage is, well, there is a monthly fee. Ian and I found that, by sort of splitting, when we first moved the system out to Spain, we split the cost between us, and it sort of softens the blow. And of course, you've got the cost of actually setting up the equipment in the first place, and getting it out to Spain, to wherever you're going, and that's not insignificant. So maybe it's a system that would suit a group of people in an astronomical society or something, a little imaging group. You may find it quite, it offsets the costs quite a lot. So what I'd like to do now, just for the next sort of 5 minutes or so, I'll just run through some images. Actually, it looks a little bit bright on the screen here. Just run through some images that we've taken, and you're also using the Telescope Live system as well. This is a very, very deep image of M82, and Ian and I, we set the LRGB data for the galaxy, and then set the system to take a very deep set of exposures through a hydrogen alpha filter to capture these outburst regions from the center of the, it's like a starburst nebula, if you like. The sky background looks a little bit bright here. I'm not quite sure why that is. That's okay. This was another one we shot from our first site in Spain with a 5-inch refractor. This, of course, is M83. And what we've done here, we've shot a lot of data, RGB data, LRGB data for the galaxy itself. And we also shot a huge amount of data, once again, with a hydrogen alpha filter to blend in to capture all these incredible H2 regions. And I think this is probably my favorite image that we took from that location, because when you zoom in on this on a high quality monitor, you get these incredible structure within all of these lovely sort of bubbles and things in the outer arms of the nebula. And again, another one of my favorites from that location, this is the so-called mountains in the mist. And I think, can't remember the exact details, but I think we're probably looking at about 60 hours worth of data here. It's an SHO image, so hydrogen, sulfur, and oxygen 3. And again, this is the Hubble palette. And I talked earlier on about the blues and the golds. This is the typical sort of Hubble palette rendition that people like, including us. We like to use these as well. And this is our most recent image from ICA. Again, a very, very deep image shot with a Takahashi refractor. This is IC410, the Tadpoles Nebula. So you can see the critters down here. And again, we shot a huge amount of data for this. I think the overall exposure time on this was probably in excess of 70 hours, shot over many weeks. And you can see it's done a great job of capturing all these faint outer sort of tendrils and things that you don't tend to see so much in images of this, this target. So we were very pleased with that. And then for telescope rental, I talked briefly about Telescope Live. This is a new system that's come online in about the last 6 months, and they have telescopes in Chile, Australia, and actually one in Spain at IC Astronomy. And of course, these telescopes are giving you great access to objects like in Sagittarius, in Scorpius, and with the Chile telescopes right down in the southern sky. So just for the next couple of minutes, I'd like to show you some of the images I've taken with the Telescope Live telescopes over the last couple of months, I suppose. And you may recognize this. This is the Eta Carina Nebula that we processed as our SHO image. And you can see I've applied much more extensive processing to what I actually did on the fly just 10 minutes ago. And again, it's one of these incredible targets. You can see all this incredible structure within it, and you know, it really responds well to these Hubble palette views. And later on in the talk at the end, I'll show you a view of this taken with one of the bigger scopes. This is actually a really incredible target in its own right. Having access to very wide field telescopes in the Southern Hemisphere gives you the chance to image things like this. This is the Large Magellanic Cloud. And this was shot with their telescope in Australia, which is a Takahashi FSQ 106 with a large format FLI camera, square sensor camera. So it's got this preposterously large field of view. But the great thing about the Magellanic Cloud, which if anybody doesn't know, this is one of the two satellite galaxies of the Milky Way. There's a large and a small Magellanic Cloud. And this obtained some measure of notoriety back in 1987 when a naked eye supernova exploded just down here close to this object, which is the Tarantula Nebula, which is actually part of the Magellanic Cloud. So using another of their telescopes from Chile with a narrow field of view, I was able to zoom in and make the Tarantula Nebula itself much more of a target. You can see it's got this incredible sort of wispy structure, and it's got all these lovely glowing sort of H2 regions just down here. Looks a bit like a sort of flower on top of a stalk. And once again, the supernova was somewhere down here. And then having the ability to use much more powerful telescopes as well, you can zoom right in on targets like this with a very different field of view. And this time, this is the narrow band view of the Tarantula Nebula using the Hubble palette, which you're probably more than familiar with now. And again, you can see that you've got this sort of the blues and the yellowy reds and golds and stuff like that. And of course, being a narrow band image, you tend to get much more structural detail in there. Well, incidentally, I will say that this is probably the hardest image I've ever had to process. I spent several weeks on this and wasn't happy with the results. And I thought, oh, I'm just going to start again, and went back and approached it from a slightly different way, and then ended up with a result which I'm very pleased with. Globular clusters, well, again, having access to big scopes under very good seeing conditions, you can get great resolution on the cores of these objects. This is Omega Centauri, which we think of as a globular cluster, but in actual fact, I think the scientific consensus, this is actually the stripped out core of a galaxy that sort of wandered too close to the Milky Way and got a bit sort of chomped up for its sins. And this is the sort of remaining core of the galaxy that's just kind of agglomerated into what looks to all of us lot as a globular cluster. Again, photographing these is a bit hit and miss because they're so bright. So I just used 300-second exposures. And the one thing I will say about with the telescope live images, which I'm showing you, they're probably the maximum total of just an hour and a half to perhaps 2 hours in exposure time. These are probably, you know, an hour and a half, something like that. I think it was like something like 6-10 minute exposures. But with the very good transparent skies and the good seeing, you don't need to take the very long exposures like Ian and I normally would do in Spain or at home. This is M83. Again, a target which we tried to image from La Palma in the past, but even from there it's a little bit low. But again, happily from Chile, it's really high in the sky. This is a lovely barred spiral galaxy. So probably this is very similar to how our own galaxy looks. And if you look carefully, you can see lots of other galaxies in the field. They're all over the place if you sort of zoom in, all in the sort of background. So again, but not particularly deep exposures. This is Centaurus A, again, one of my favorite targets just because it's so weird. This is actually a collision of two, but potentially three galaxies. In the background, a massive elliptical. In the foreground, what was once a spiral galaxy. They're combined, they're colliding. Incidentally, none of the stars are likely to actually combine. The gravitational and tidal effect stir everything up, and you see this spiral galaxy has been a little bit sort of ripped up, but it gives you this incredible and unique target. It's something we can't see from from Britain, but Ian and I think we attempted to image this in the early days. Even from La Palma, it's fairly low though. One of my favourite images, this is again one of my favourite galaxies as well. This is NGC 1365 in Fornax. So again, a very exotic object This was shot with their 1 meter telescope, which is actually on an alt-azimuth mount. And just a wonderful image, a wonderful galaxy. You know, these are one of the most incredible sort of objects in the sky, I think, and taken under what looked to be pretty good seeing conditions as well. Well, we saw this image earlier on. This is the Trifid in Sagittarius. And you can see I've processed this a lot more heavily than we saw in Fitch Liberator and Photoshop. I've probably processed this initially in PixInsight with some final work in Photoshop. This is a more recent image, which is actually under construction at the moment. This is the Helix Nebula, shot with their Chile 1 telescope, which is a 24-inch plane wave telescope. And this is a fairly deep image at this stage, because I'm interested in trying to capture these cometary globules that are kind of radial from the central star. It's a planetary nebula, but I say this is under construction because I'm waiting for more data to come through to add to this. So this isn't a finished image yet, but the weather out there at the moment I think is a little bit pants, shall we say. So I'm just waiting for the rest of the data to come through to finish that off. And then this is that really weird object that I showed you in the outer sort of extremities of the Eta Carina Nebula. It's called NGC 3324. And if you've ever seen images of this, it's actually, you can imagine rotating it by 90 degrees, and it shows the outline of a face here. But I find that really, really distracting and horrible, because I give it some silly name as usual. So what I've done here, I've actually just rotated it, and you lose that horrible look, and it gains this lovely sort of three-dimensionality. So I much prefer.
There's now 100 people twisting their neck, Nick.
Yeah. If you look at it that way on, it looks like a geezer's face. You can see that's his nose, and that's his sort of mouth, and that's his chin, and that's his sort of forehead here. I think it's like an Argentinian poet or something it's supposed to look like, but that's horrible. It's just NGC 3324. So I've kind of, I don't suppose it makes much difference which way you look at these things. You can choose. And the Eagle Nebula, again, one of my sort of favourite targets in the sky. Ian and I got a very nice image of this from ICA, again, a very, very deep image. And it's quite interesting that that image compares very well with this. And this was shot with their 24-inch plane wave again. And it's, again, very short exposures. There was a few sort of technical issues in that I didn't get the full data set. So this is only made up of something like four 10-minute H-alpha exposures and 3 or 4 O3 and 3 or 4 5 S2. So it's a very shallow image, but you can see with sort of careful processing, you can bring a lot of this stuff out. And this, again, one of my favorites, this is NGC, I have to look it up because I'm so unfamiliar with these targets, NGC 3576. It's got the name of the Statue of Liberty Nebula. Again, another one of these really silly names, but that's based on this sort of character in here, which sort of vaguely looks like the Statue of Liberty. But again, it's one of those really, really sort of enigmatic targets with this incredible sort of three-dimensionality to it and the structure. And again, not a particularly deep set of exposures. You know, if I could get time on these scopes that, you know, Ian and I do on the one in ICA, you know, these images would just be incredible. Okay. If you want to, that's the end of the talk, by the way. If you want to get lots more details on all of the stuff I've talked about and tons more, get hold of this from Astronomy Now. I think it's $10.99, and it covers everything that I've talked about in much, much more detail, and plus a load of other stuff as well. So I'll hand me over to the guys, and if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to talk through them with you.
That was great, Nick. Thanks very much. Take a minute and have a slurp of water. You've done remarkable. That's yeah. Take a breather for a minute. So lots of expected comments. Excellent. Many thanks, Nick. Some fantastic images. Somebody said we're in the presence of an astro god. Clearly a fan, or okay. So. This has certainly inspired Happy Cat. He's come up with a whole raft of questions. So first one, Should be a simple one. What version of Photoshop were you using there, Nick?
Yeah, okay, good question. I'm using the very latest version, which is, it's only available now as a cloud subscription, Creative Cloud, I think they call it.
Yeah.
It works out about 10 quid a month. And for that, you get the very latest up-to-date version of Photoshop, plus Lightroom, which is a really nice program, and Bridge, which is a great file browser. Whether you want to pay 10 quid a month for Photoshop, I mean, I was against that originally, but I thought, well, I'd like to try out the very latest version because it has got some really good features, and I'm still doing it. But I would say, if anyone's been reading my articles in Astronomy Now, I've been waxing lyrical about a piece of software called Affinity Photo, and that's almost equal to Photoshop in terms of its power, its layout. You know, it's really, really got 95% of Photoshop. And at the moment, it's on sale for $23.99.
Oh, wow.
So get it now while it's cheap. Even if you're not planning on using it straight away, if you get fed up with Photoshop, Affinity Photo will do pretty much everything that Photoshop does. It looks very similar. All of their menu structure is almost identical. It's just like a clone of Photoshop, effectively. But rather than paying that 10 quid a month, $23.99 straight off. It's updated every couple of months. It's the bargain of the century in terms of image processing software.
I shall be off straight after this to...
One thing I should bear in mind, of course, as I said earlier on, remember that it won't open your FITS files. It's not an astronomy program.
No.
So you'll need to use FITS Liberator or something else just to convert them into TIFF files.
So as a follow-up, Nick, is there anything major missing from Affinity that that you would like to see or would expect to see in there?
There's one thing. It's called HDR toning,
Okay.
which is a one-click button effectively in Photoshop that does a really good job of doing that kind of logarithmic scaling. Affinity's got like a poor man's version of it, but it's pretty poor. But the only other thing I would say, or two things, one is that when it comes to doing RGB combination in Photoshop, it's really easy just using the channels menu. In Affinity, it's awful. I just couldn't work it out. I had to get help. It's so sort of weird and roundabout, but it does a great job. But you just need to be prepared to spend like 6 months working out how to actually use it before you actually get an RGB image. But that is all covered in the next issue of Astronomy Now, I think. The other thing I would say, just briefly on the subject of Affinity, they seem to be very receptive to people saying, well, you know, Photoshop has got this, why haven't you? And they'll try and get it in, I think. They seem to be very receptive to their sort of users. They're very kind of friendly and approachable. And all the menus are in proper English spelling as well, which is great. Political, but it's just wonderful. I recommend get it now while it's $23.99. If you get fed up with Photoshop or you're working with an old version of Photoshop, you may find Affinity just does everything for you.
Cool. Thanks for that. Somebody's posted, actually, it's on a 90-day free trial as well. So
indeed, which is a long time, actually.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, absolutely.
The only thing you might find is that after the 90-day trial is up, it may have gone up in price.
It may have gone up in price, yeah. Very true, very true. Okay, slightly more technical again from Happy Cat. Is the full width half max in Maxim different to the one in DSS, or is it a universal definition across the two?
Well, I have to be perfectly honest to say I'm not sure. I suspect that they're going to be fairly similar. I've never used that function in Deep Sky Stacker, I don't think. I'm not a Deep Sky Stacker user other than just to assess it and you know, maybe do the odd Milky Way shot. So I'm not sure is the answer, but I would suspect that they're going to be fairly similar.
Similar, yeah. Okay, jolly good. Like I said, Happy Cat was on a roll, so third one straight in a line from him. Can we use FITS Liberator to split color from a FITS file to make 3 new files so that we can then go on and process those individually?
There's a very easy answer to that, and it's no. FITS Liberator will only work with single monochrome images.
Okay.
You can't do any processing on color work at all. So it's just to convert your monochrome images, whether they're RGB or LRGB or narrowband, into fits, and then you have to do all the color work in Photoshop or
in
Affinity.
Photoshop. Okay, got that.
There was a couple before that, Des.
Yeah, carry on.
Dave asked, it'd be great if those 4 images of the original image of the Milky Way could be made available to practice alongside your video. If there's any chance of that. Not everyone likes to share their data, but if you...
No, that's fine. They're slightly shrunken down just to make things a little bit quicker, but I'll arrange to get those uploaded to somewhere where you can download them. Or if you think it's better and you actually want to work with the full size images, let me know and I'll upload those as well. But that's fine.
Super. Thank you for that, Nick.
Yeah, thanks so much.
I also had a private one from Ian. He was saying, if there is time at the end, I wonder if you could ask Nick if he would process RGB data with a false luminance, and whether he feels that adds anything. And if so, would you just stack all of the RGBs together to create that false luminance?
I'm not sure I understand what a false luminance is.
So I think what he's saying is, could you use all 3 channels to create a luminance channel that you then add back in, and whether that does anything?
Try it, I suppose. I'll do that in Photoshop with the data we were looking at earlier on. So if I open, make sure I've actually got these as RGBs. So we had...
Nick, while you're just doing that, Helen's just added in the chat that full width half max is a standard measure, so it should be pretty much the same in both programs.
That doesn't surprise me, actually. Yeah. I mean, the only thing that might change is what either DSS or Maxim use to actually measure the full width half maximum. The actual measure itself is the same. It's just the width at half.
Just the algorithm they're using.
Yeah,
I suspect it means the tightest star in one program will be the tightest in the other. Values might differ, but yeah.
Just a NASA scientist to know that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So the false luminance was... Just run that by me again. Sorry, I'm kind of...
I think you were saying if you've got... I forget, Ian, you might want to add to this in case I've misunderstood as well, but I think you're saying if you've got an RGB image, can you enhance it by combining all of those into one mono image to then add back in as your luminance channel?
I think what would happen is you'd end up with exactly the same image.
Yeah.
So if I was to take this one and split it into its 3 channels, what I would end up with is these 3.
Yeah. I'm not sure what you're gaining by doing that, because you
wouldn't gain anything.
You're not taking away anything or adding anything.
No. It's kind of akin to a question I used to get asked a lot in the early days of CCD, and people said, "Why can't you stack the same image twice to improve the the signal to noise ratio?" And unfortunately, that it just doesn't work. And I believe this would be akin to doing something like that. If I'm understanding the question right, there's that's like a kind of free lunch scenario, and I don't think there's anything that can be done. You could split the RGB image into 3 separate files, but if you're going to process the images which you've split from the RGB file, you might as well just process the original monochrome RGB images. I apologise if I've got the wrong end of the stick there. If that's
Ian's just right, saying question is whether you get a better signal to noise ratio if you stack all of the subs.
Well, that would always happen, but remember these have been stacked anyway.
Yeah.
Each of these individual, the blue, green, and the red, are already stacked with the subs. So this one on the screen, for example, the green, it's probably 4 10-minute exposures which have been aligned and stacked and calibrated and everything.
Yeah.
And then these are the ones that make up that.
Steve Richards just added saying that it allows you to sharpen the false luminance in mono, which can have some advantages when added as a luminance layer. So I guess it does let you separate things a little bit, maybe.
Well, okay, but I still don't. Okay, I'll go with that. I mean, if Steve's done it, then I'm happy with that. I've never been asked that before, so I'm a bit on the back foot. So, sorry.
Well, on a similar theme, which might make more sense actually, though, Nick, is any chance of a quick demo of combining HA highlights into the LRGB image?
Or is that a talk all in itself?
Well, quite possibly, yeah.
it's a little bit more tricky to do, but what I'm trying to think about is if I've got any data that's readily accessible that is RGB and narrowband. I think most of my data sets now are one or the other.
One or the other.
I could possibly do that in the future.
Well, is that something we can maybe in a future talk ask you?
Yeah.
Back,
it's more tricky, actually. I mean, earlier on I did show an image of the Orion Nebula, which had, in fact, it was the Orion Nebula that had a luminance hydrogen alpha exposure, which gives you all this incredible sort of structural detail in it. And that was combined with RGB data, but I'd have to sort of go and dig those out because that was done about 10 years ago, I think. But yeah, it's a possibility I could run through that because it is a little bit more tricky.
Sure. I suspect, absolutely. And I suspect there are many of those sorts of things that we could spend whole talks on looking at some of those in detail. Okay, comments coming in thick and, okay, Carol says, she meant into a galaxy. I think sort of referring back to the M82 then with the HA that you'd applied to that to show the jets on that. But again, I think we'll come back to that as a later topic.
Okay.
Richard Miller says, is Shooting Stars 2 the same as Shooting Stars 2nd edition, or are
they made a bit of a mistake with that when they were advertising it. It's a brand new edition, completely separate from Shooting Stars. It's not a 2nd edition, it's Shooting Stars 2, so it's all new content compared to that first one.
Cool. There we go, Richard. Hope that answers that.
There's one from Ian Hodgson. A similar question to what he asked Steve Richards last week, actually, which was any tips on methods for narrowband type imaging with one-shot colours and things like the L-enhanced filters? Have you done anything like that?
I haven't, actually. I get asked quite a lot about them, and I've seen some very, very good results. So it's definitely doable. I'm not personally a great fan of one-shot colour cameras. I think I'm with Steve on this. I'm kind of old school, and Ian as well. In that we sort of grew up using CCD cameras, learning the ropes, and whilst whilst one-shot color cameras are brilliant for people who just want to go out and they haven't got a lot of time or anything like that, or they don't want to fork out millions for filters and stuff like that, or thousands. They're great tools, but you'll always get better results using a monochrome camera with filters. But having said that, you can get these new types of filters that work particularly well with DSLR cameras, and you'll have to take longer exposures to get those results. If you're able to do that, you'll actually get really, really good results. So it's definitely doable. Yeah.
I think there's been quite a few questions about that, so I think that's probably worthy of a topic for a future talk if we can find somebody that's into that area. So.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, another very similar question to one that Steve had to face last week. Do you have a view on the current debate on CMOS versus CCD, Nick?
Well, again, I'm in a very similar vein to what Steve said. I'm a great lover of CCD cameras, and I've always used them, and I just they do what they say on the tin. Now, times are changing. There is going to be a gradual switch over towards CMOS sensors, and I think each have got their pluses and minuses. But I think what's happening with these CMOS cameras that are becoming available, they're much cheaper, so they are allowing more people to get into the hobby. So it's a good thing in that sense. Maybe there's more noise issues, maybe there's other sort of issues that go with them, but I'd like to still be able to use CCDs in the future. I hope they don't get sort of phased out completely, and we were forced to change over to CMOS. So, yeah.
Yes, I think that's one that's going to run for some time. And obviously, there's advancements coming in the CMOS technology all the time. So Absolutely. It's going to be interesting to see what happens.
There's a lot of money behind the
yeah.
So with digital cameras and stuff like that. So maybe the future will be really bright, and we'll be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question, please? Can I have special permission? You're using a Moonlight on your main imaging rig, and there's a fierce debate on the forums about this, that there's a lot of people that believe Moonlights can't be used for imaging. They're not good enough to be used for imaging. How do you find your Moonlight? Have you ever had issues? I mean, you've got a big payload on the back as well.
Actually, that camera actually isn't that heavy. Again, because it's all kind of integrated into one. Never had any problems with it. except once I was asked to review a camera, a Moravian camera with a huge sensor in it. And honestly, this thing was about a foot square with, you know, huge filters and filter wheel and everything. And the poor old Moonlight, it just couldn't handle it. But, you know, there's bigger Moonlight focusers that would. So my vote's with Moonlight. I've never had any problems with the imaging rig I'm using at the moment. It's absolutely fine, very reproducible.
Thank you.
Okay, going back to the, I think this was on about the Panama stacked Milky Way shot. Was it stacked and then merged? And is it best to stop it down, e.g. F4?
Yeah,
the La Palma, not Pan.
Yes,
sorry,
it was La Palma, yeah, absolutely right. I mean, the what if I can just briefly go to one of those ones.
Just while Nick's looking for that, there's lots of comments coming in about the M33 image having the HA data in, but it was a finished image. I think your point, Nick, was that you didn't have the data set here now in order to demo that adding in of the hydrogen alpha, but we'll pick that up at a later time.
Yeah, I've got it somewhere buried on the hard drive. I'd have to sort of
that's fine.
That out.
I think that would be a really good thing for a more advanced, you know, if you could do another one of these in the future, maybe that just takes it a step further. That would be a really good, you know, I'd enjoy that.
That was a senior moment on my behalf. Both the M82 and the M33 did actually have the H-alpha.
Yeah, no, that's
forgot about
that's fine.
Right, so, yeah, but yeah, I can come back and show you how that's done in the future because there's several different ways of doing it with varying levels of success. So to come back to the Milky Way shot, this was I've talked about the problems with the you know, the cheap lens and the sort of the distortion at the end. When I was a film photographer and I used to go out to La Palma to do this kind of stuff, I always used to stop my 50mm lens down from f2 to f2.8, and it just eradicated all those lens distortions around the edge. So yes, I would recommend that close your lens down from its maximum by a stop or so, and if it means just upping your ISO or exposure times, go for it, because optically you should get a better result. Definitely worth doing.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Nick. And then one from John's iPhone. Anyway, if it's a desert island disc question, Nick, if you could only shoot one target again, what would it be and why?
What, in terms of like a favourite target?
Yeah.
From my garden, or even perhaps from Spain, you know, things like the Andromeda Galaxy and the Orion Nebula and stuff like that, you never tire of imaging them. You go back to them with new equipment and stuff like that. And, you know, as your techniques get better, your instrumentation gets better, you can always just go back and revisit these things. So, but of course now I'm hopelessly in love with all these objects in the Southern Hemisphere that you just dreamed about as a kid, or when you sort of used to read David Malin's books and stuff like that, you know, the Eta Carina Nebula and the Magellanic Clouds and all this kind of stuff. So, you know, those images I showed earlier on, some of those towards the end, you know, they're just absolutely spectacular targets. I could spend all night, you know, just imaging them again and again. So, and they're all great targets. Everything's great, but
there's just a couple new questions, but there's a couple of older ones we missed on the way. Well, one was Simon saying, can you get similar results with Coral as Photoshop and Affinity?
Yeah, well, I suspect so. I mean, Coral always used to be like a sort of a drawing package and stuff like that. And then I think they expanded it so it had sort of more what I'll call image processing capabilities. But I've not heard about that for a long time now. But
it was initially called Coral Draw, wasn't it, as I remember?
It was called Coral Draw, yeah. I used to use, my wife used to use it as well, and it was pretty good. But you know, I do know of people that were actually using it some years ago for image processing and getting fairly good results. But I can't give you a definitive answer because I haven't used it for about 25 years or something. So,
and one other question about Infinity was, do the plugins work for it, HVLG, etc.?
I don't know. I can tell you one that does work, and again, I've covered this in the next article in Astronomy Now. I was very surprised to see in Affinity that Gradient Exterminator works in there. And that surprised me because it's a Photoshop plugin. So I think what's happened is Affinity's had a sort of little look to see what's in Photoshop and thought, what's that? We'll have some of that. and it's kind of sort of grabbed it. But the trouble is, when you run it, it asks for your username and serial number every time. So if I want to use it in Affinity, what I do, I've got those, you know, in a little text file somewhere. I just copy those into the memory, and if I need to use it, you put those in, and then it works just exactly the same as it does in Photoshop. The other one that was mentioned, which I've sort of heard of, but I haven't actually used it yet, so I'll have to come back on that a little bit later on. I'm not sure what that other plugin actually does.
No. Okay, thank you. Are you going to be reviewing the new EOS R?
The new what? Sorry.
The EOS R, the new
the new Canon camera.
The new Canon camera,
yeah.
yeah.
Yes, sorry, yes, I've just heard about that recently. If they want me to, I'll certainly give it a try. I've seen there's a guy in the States called Alan Dyer, who is one of the staff writers for Astronomy magazine, and I'm a follower of his Flickr site, and he's getting some very, very good results with it. So yeah, it looks like it's got a lot of potential. It's very expensive.
Yeah, it's about
I think it's
2.5, 2.6, something like that, isn't it? It's, yeah.
There's an astrophotography version though, isn't there? I think.
Well, I think that is the actual Astro. That is it.
The RA.
The RA.
There's an R or there's an RA, but yeah.
Right, you're absolutely right. The RA is the one that's again, it must have the same modification as you know, the other sort of Canon ones had, where they, you know, remove the filter.
Yeah.
Yeah, if anyone wants me to review that for them, I'll certainly give it a try.
That's very good. Here. That's very good. You'll take one for the team, will you, on that one?
Yeah. It's a tough job, but someone's got to do it. If it comes along, I'll certainly give it a go. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, but yes, I saw the review of that. It looked very interesting. Do you have an opinion on PixInsight, and if so, how does it compare against Photoshop for the Astro processing?
That's a very loaded question, dare I say. Like everybody else, I probably have got a lot of opinions on it, but I'll tell you how I find it. First and foremost, I found it very difficult to get started with it. But you know, there are more and more very good online tutorials, and if you kind of stick with it, it's a bit like learning a language. You can get fairly good with it, and it's got some incredibly good features. So I do use it all the time. But what I also tend to find is I don't like the tools it uses to give pictures that kind of final bit of bling, dare I say. It's not a very scientific term, but you know, I think if you're conversing with Photoshop, you can get really, really nice looking images. Now, I can normally, if I look at an image on Flickr or, you know, on someone's website or something like that, I can normally tell when an image has been processed exclusively in PixInsight. They've got this sort of brownish look to them. And so what I would say, PixInsight's brilliant for cleaning up cosmetic artifacts, for calibration, for the nuts and bolts of CCD imaging. But then I'll always use Photoshop right at the end, particularly making use of Photoshop's layers menu. And again, the PixInsight mob, they're very snobbish about things. Like, I'm going to get lynched at the next meeting. They're very snobbish about the use of layers and things like that. Whereas, you know, I think if a particular tool does a very good job for your images and you're happy with them, then, you know, I'm quite happy to use layers. There's things like that that PixInsight doesn't have yet. And I'll end on that.
I think it's probably aspirational that they will at some point be able to implement or emulate the layers. But I think you're absolutely right. I think it's horses for courses, isn't it? It's what you know, what you're used to doing, and
whatever floats your boat. I mean, PixInsight is brilliant. It continues to get even better as with each new sort of upgrade that comes along. It's a brilliant piece of software. And I know, you know, when it first came out, it was available as a free edition.
Yeah,
and you know, I tried. I thought, oh, I can't get on with this. I tried to like it, couldn't get on with it, and just left it. And everybody else was saying the same. And then suddenly, all of a sudden, PixInsight is flavour of the month, and you know, everybody's using it now. But as I said, some great online tutorials if you're prepared to put a little bit of time in on it, as I've done, and you know, everybody else would have had to do. It's brilliant. It is a lovely piece of software. Yeah, I love it. It's great.
Yeah.
Probably best to just bring the questions in, and we've got one more, I think, from David Banks, who was just saying that after many years of cursing the moon, the devil's hand and torch, I've recently started imaging it whilst my DSO rig is put away for the summer. Any tips for processing the raw images? I can't say I've ever seen any lunar images from you, Nick. Is it something you do?
Yeah, I do them occasionally. Yeah, I will give you some tips. It depends what kind of equipment you're using. You know, you can get great images of the moon with a DSLR. You can get great images of the moon with a one-shot color camera. For me, though, again, me being a stuck in the mud CCDer, I find that I get really, really nice results by just taking monochrome images rather than color. And quite by accident, many years ago, I discovered that if you take narrowband images of the moon, i.e. you use a hydrogen alpha filter and oxygen 3, you get these incredibly sharp images of the moon, because I think they're helping to smooth out things like, because it's such a narrow bandwidth, I mean, I might be wrong here, it's such a narrow bandwidth that they tend to withhold like atmospheric dispersion, stuff that can degrade color images. So what I do when I'm imaging the moon, you know, a good time to do that, of course, is like the wide crescent, half moon, or you know, gibbous moon, where you get the sideways on illumination, you get all the craters and stuff like that. But if you use a narrowband filter, if you've got a monochrome camera, use that, because it'll give you these incredibly sharp images. And what you'll also find is that those images should respond really well to further sharpening. There's lots of things within Photoshop. Again, maybe I can come back in the future, because there was a couple of things I meant to show tonight, but kind of ran out of time. But there's some really nice sharpening tools in Photoshop again, and Affinity as well, equally good. And I've recently been working on a new piece of software, which does seem to be gaining popularity with Astro Images, from Topaz Labs. They do two lots of software. One's called Topaz Sharpen AI, and it's available as a plugin or a standalone for Photoshop. And that uses some kind of AI purportedly to give you very sharp images. And I tried it on one of my lunar images from a little while back, and the result was just absolutely unbelievable. The sharpness, and, you know, really nice smooth image. So yeah, if you're able to use a narrowband filter, give it a go, because you'll find that you'll get these really lovely tonal values. Just be careful to set your exposure so that you don't overexpose any of the brightest parts, because there are a couple of bright craters and stuff like that. Just set your exposure time, take lots of images. If you're working with a CCD camera of any description, you don't need to stack the images. Just take single images, just take loads of them, assess them for the best one in terms of the seeing, and then just you know, process them and sharpen them, and you'll get some absolutely great results. Yeah, like a lot of my sort of friends, I do curse the moon, because it always seems to be clear when there's a full moon in the sky, except when there's a total eclipse of the moon, and then it's just cloudy.
Yeah.
But you know, I love it as much as everybody else. I'm a deep skyer. I like to sort of do all the deep sky stuff, but I do love the moon as well. I love going out early hours and seeing the sort of the waning crescent moon in the early mornings. Just the moon's great.
I always like it at this sort of this time of year and this time of night, just as it's you know, dusk is starting to fall, and it's what is it? It's about halfway at the moment, isn't it? So, and it looks really, really nice. It looks
great. If you go out with a pair of binoculars or something like that, you can see all the wonderful stuff on there. It is the moon's brilliant. I love it. It is,
yeah, fantastic, fantastic. I did think I had a photo, actually. I do remember seeing an image that you'd taken, and it was probably at an Astrofest, Nick, where you'd taken it was an image of the moon, not at full, obviously, and it was a single frame shot, and it was absolutely razor sharp. You could cut your fingers just holding the picture.
Thanks. Yeah. Again, I think that's more due to the hydrogen alpha filter that would have been used, because you can get these really sort of pinpoint focus, and it's worth spending a bit of, like with all forms of imaging, it's worth spending a little bit of time on that. To just bear with me 1 second. I'll give up immediately if this isn't where I think it is. But I might be able to just show you that recent image. Okay. if you can you see that?
Yeah, yeah.
So again, that's the Hydrogen Alpha view, and there's all sorts of things you can do to that. But if you look at these little bits and pieces up here, the thing you have to be very careful of is bits like whatever. I'm sorry, I'm not a lunar observer. I do apologise to any.
I was about to say, is there a lunar expert in the house to tell us what it is we're looking at? Because
got a bright bit over there, which can sort of overexpose your images. So use that as when you're imaging in this kind of phase. Use that bit as your sort of reference exposure. It's possible that some of these are a tad overexposed, and of course, that other one over there, Aristarchus. I've remembered it. That's incredibly bright. So if you're imaging that side of the moon, whatever that side is, you'll have to be overexposed on that. But again, you can see, because there's not much colour on the moon, I think it's actually beneficial to. Now, this won't compare, of course, with the webcammers. The people who are doing the so-called lucky imaging, where they're shooting all the multiple frames. A single frame like this can't combine with the tools that they people like Damien Peach and all that can never. But compare with that. But with if you're interested in sort of wide field imaging, this is just a single shot. It does give you sort of pretty good views of it. So.
Yeah. Excellent.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Yeah, I think that's it. Nick, many thanks for giving up your Sunday evening. Thank you everybody again for joining. There's still over 70 people online, so people are obviously very interested in this. Thank you everybody for your questions. We will sort out the video. Oh yes, please. Yeah.
So next week we're going sort of more the observers route next week. So we've got Dave Eagle coming in to give us a talk all about the summer observing targets and some challenges. And we've asked him to point out some more challenging things and maybe some more unusual things that we wouldn't normally think about. So he's going to do a whole talk on that. So that should be very good. Excellent. So obviously we'll post up the information on that, and the video from this talk will be up as soon as Grant can get it rendered and in a suitable format for uploading. Nick, many thanks again for your time. Everybody, thanks very much. We will see you all online shortly. Thanks very much. Cheers all. Good night. Good night.